Hello everyone, and welcome to the third in our Lent series on my book How to Eat Bread, 21 Nourishing Ways to Read the Bible, thinking about different ways that the Bible itself uses the Bible, which is the subject of the first section of this book. And today we're going to look at chapter 3, which is about the image in the Psalms on meditating on the law. Now that's a really unpopular and odd word nowadays in Christian circles. The law, it sounds legalistic, it sounds quite unpleasant. We've had years of having quoted at us the law kills, but the Spirit gives life. One of the most frequently quoted things in the Bible, and also centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, which have led us to thinking of kind of the law as something that those Pharisees did, which Christianity was here to get rid of. But of course, Jesus said that while he came to radically reinterpret the law, he was eating food on the Sabbath and so on, and telling people that, the rules were there for people, not people for the rules. He also said, there in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 5, that he hadn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, and that not one stroke of a letter was irrelevant or obsolete. And the Psalms really focus on the idea of meditating on the law and contemplating it. So I want us to just spend a little bit of time exploring what that means. And the first thing to say is that when the Psalms talk about the law, that's probably not a very helpful translation. It's the best translation we've got, but it doesn't mean laws. It doesn't mean rules and regulations. It doesn't mean meditate on a list of rules. It doesn't mean meditate on the 10 Commandments. The law, in the terms that the Psalm uses it, means a whole collection, a kind of cloud of texts and of thinking. It's quite a broad and quite a diffuse category, and it's made up of various concentric circles, if you imagine an archery target or something. At its heart are the 10 Commandments, but then you've got the kind of whole context that those commandments were given in, the theological history of Israel contained in those first 5 books of the Bible, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. They're all part of what it means to say the law. Of course, they're not all law, lots of them are stories, but that's all part of the law. And then there's a kind of third, even bigger circle, zooming even further out, which includes all the history and tradition of commentary and rabbinical arguments and debates on those books and commandments. Because for the Jews at Jesus' time, the law didn't simply mean the scriptures. It meant all that whole kind of tradition of commentary and debate. People saying, well, what about this? And then, a bit like lawyers now, don't just refer to the actual laws that Parliament have passed. They refer to the history of judges' decisions and sentencing and so on. And that becomes part of the law. It creates law as the laws are interpreted and applied. That's very much what the Old Testament means when it talks about the law. It has that whole wider sense of how has this actually been applied and used through history. And the idea of meditating on the law is a really big focus throughout the book of Psalms. In here I quote the first Psalm, Psalm 1, which really sets it up. Let me read it to you now. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in season, and their leaves do not wither. And so on. And of course, famously the longest psalm, Psalm 119, which is a really long acrostic poem. You might have remembered doing them at school, where you kind of write down a word and then you have to start each line of the poem with the first letter of that word. In Psalm 119, each verse, each little section begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's all about the joys and the delights and the consequences of meditating on the law. And I think that's the first thing to say about what the Psalms mean when they talk about meditating on the law. It's meant to be something that gives delight. It's not about thinking about rules and regulations and making sure you obey them, which is what the word law tends to mean for us most naturally. This is about loving it. Joy, delight. Think of those psalms, like the famous Psalm 42. As the deer pants for running water, so my soul longs for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God. And this idea of being a tree, putting down your roots into the living water, is so fundamental for what the book of Psalms, the Old Testament generally, means and thinks about when it talks about meditating on the law. So it's important to notice that it's something really natural. All the biological, organic imagery of trees and vines and fruit and so on, partly is there to suggest to us that this is not something that we have to work really, really hard at. This isn't some unnatural activity that we have to kind of twist ourselves and cut bits of ourselves off to be able to do. It's not a hard task. It's not something that requires specialist equipment. It's something that anyone can do day or night. And that if we put ourselves in the right place, that is, if we read the Bible, will happen naturally. Like a tree planted by streams of water, our roots will go down and seek out the water, the nourishment that they can get in those texts. And the fruitfulness that results will just come naturally from being planted there. That's the way we're made. It's a really beautiful image. So it's a delight and it's natural. And that in itself is so different from how we tend to think about law, and how we kind of wince and can feel our body language doing this when we think about law and legalism and having to obey rules. That's not what the psalmist is talking about. And I just find this image of roots so interesting and so helpful. The image of the branching roots of a tree reaching deep into the soil. Now, Psalm 1 tells us two things about that. One of them is that our roots firmly anchor us. It contrasts a tree that's planted firmly. You might, in these recent storms, I've been walking in the park and I've seen trees totally uprooted. It's an incredible sight, isn't it? These huge root balls kind of lying there. It looks so unnatural. Generally, we expect trees to be rooted, and apart from in the very, very biggest storms or at the very end of their lives, they're firmly rooted, so that even in the biggest winds, generally, they just sway and rock, but stay firm. And that's the first thing that Psalm 1 is talking about, being rooted in a tradition. Might think back to what we were talking about last week about Jesus being rooted in the tradition of Deuteronomy when he's having that dialogue with the devil. So being rooted in the tradition, reading the Bible and spending time contemplating on it, meditating on it, just roots us firmly, keeps us standing when adverse weather comes. And in Psalm 1, that image of a tree that's firmly rooted is contrasted with chaff. Chaff's a very agricultural word. When grain is picked in the fields and then it has to be threshed, you basically bash it with whips. And that takes the hard outer core off the kernels of grain. You take up the grain, which is quite heavy, and the chaff gets blown away. So you do it generally on a windy day on a threshing floor, and you hope the breeze will take away the light chaff. The whole point is it's light, it floats, it's got nothing anchoring it down. So it just gets blown away by the wind. It's an incredibly powerful image if you've grown up and are aware of that kind of agricultural imagery. A really real contrast. We might think now of autumn leaves, perhaps, just drifting wherever the wind takes them. So being rooted in the tradition, reading the Bible so that we're rooted in it and can cope with storms. A bit like the imagery of building your house on the rock or the sand in the Gospels. But of course, roots aren't just about stability and being fixed in one place. Roots are themselves living, growing things. It's not like you've got a living tree, but kind of dead roots. Roots are themselves, they're always on a journey. They're seeking out and growing towards water and nourishment. And that sense of longing and desire and seeking out and journeying and following the right path and seeking what nourishes us are really important themes repeatedly throughout the Psalms as they think about and contemplate what meditating on the law is and how joyful the psalmist finds it. There is an element of learning and teaching, learning the scriptures, making sure that you're taught them, finding out about them, learning that kind of case law and what the commentators have said rather than just what the Bible says. But it's not primarily about learning facts so that you know them, learning the laws so that you know you don't break them. It's more in line with the kind of wisdom tradition that's there in all sorts of different religious traditions. We might call it Enlightenment today. We're spending time on contemplating apparently simple things or paradoxical things, things that don't seem to make any sense, is seen as itself being where enlightenment comes. So contemplating mysteries, contemplating paradoxes, and we might think of some of those really problematic stories in the Bible, like Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, or Noah's Ark, and the sort of lovely contrast of this image of the ark with all the animals in there twos, and and all the people who've been drowned. It's a very strange story, really, to tell children. So contemplating these really difficult stories of rape and murder and people doing horrible things to each other. And also contemplating apparently very, very simple things. And that in contemplating both the paradoxical and the simple and the mysterious, it's the act of contemplating of those things that leads to enlightenment and to rootedness. It's not about finding answers. That's not what the Psalms mean by contemplating the law. It's simply about spending time with the things either that you find beautiful or that you find puzzling, and sitting with that beauty or that puzzlement. So I think this is a brilliant way to try, and if you're doing this in a group or you're doing it on your own, have a go at this exercise. Try printing out a page of the Bible. You might have a journaling Bible. I quite like these Bibles that Hodder produced, which have got big wide margins. You can either get them with lines or plain, where you can have a passage and print it out, or just go online and find a bit from the Bible and print it out, so that you've got plenty of white space around it. Sometimes people panic about writing in their actual Bible. And try just sketching a little tiny tree at the top and then roots, and just start drawing a root and see what word you want it to go to. What words? Doesn't have to be a whole sentence or something that makes sense, but are there words that seem to you to be kind of life-giving water, or rocks that your root might curl around to give you stability? And then maybe you want to draw ones going off the page. You might go, oh, actually that little word there, that makes me think of that other story. You could write in that story at the side. And then you might, after you've done that, after you've kind of drawn a kind of pattern of roots all through the reading, picking out particular words, particular phrases, that you want to spend time contemplating, that you think are life-giving, that give you some sort of sense of rootedness and stability. And where your roots might go off. If there's nothing that you find life-giving in there, what other stories nearby might you find nourishment in? Sometimes soil is really stony and the roots need to go around in all sorts of different places to get the nourishment they need. And then maybe up at the tiny little tree that you've drawn up at the top margin, try drawing some little fruit and thinking, if this is the nourishment that my roots would be getting from this passage, what if this was the only passage I had in the Bible? What fruit would grow from that? Might be quite sour fruit, like a lemon. Probably not going to be a balanced diet because you've only got one passage, but just thinking about it in terms of, if my tree was rooted in this passage, what would come? That can be a really interesting exercise to do, particularly I think on those books from those first five books of the Bible, thinking of those as the kind of deep-rooted soil that we can grow in. So try that with stories from Genesis or from Exodus, or weird bits from Numbers or Deuteronomy or so on, particularly if there's a passage that you find quite problematic. It can be a really interesting exercise to do this. Do it quietly in a group and then compare your results. Or the other thing, I'll just show you this, because this is what we did in church on Sunday. We were talking about the passage we looked at last week, Jesus talking with the devil. And we talked about Jesus being rooted in the Old Testament, and we had a bit of flip chart paper. Let me go back a bit so you can see more of it. Bit of flip chart paper, and we drew a tree, we drew the waters of the Jordan, and then we just started saying, okay, what stories are you rooted in? What stories can you remember from the Bible, from the Old Testament, from the New Testament? And we went round the circle. This was in the youth group, so teenagers, with them saying some favourite stories. So what have we got here? This was the first one, the one about the poor woman and the rich man giving different amounts of money. Isn't that interesting? It's the first story someone remembered. The smashing of the stone tablets when Moses came down from the mountain and was angry about the Israelites worshipping the golden calf, and he smashed those first set of stone tablets. We've got the crucifixion, healing stories, the Exodus. And then we started going off them and going, okay, what other stories does that remind you of? And then we started thinking about the fruits. It's a really fun exercise to do. You don't have to have a particular passage. You can simply draw a tree with a group, could be children, could be adults, and say, okay, what are our roots? What are the most important big taproot stories that we want to think about? And then what are the little thread roots coming off that? What are other stories that makes us think of? So a fun exercise to try, either on your own, either drawing on a Bible or a Bible printout, or just get a big bit of plain paper, or you could do it yourself just on a normal sheet of a notebook or something, and just contemplate your roots and what stories you seek out with delight, and what fruit you think those stories, knowing those stories and spending time with those stories produces in your life. So have fun with that this week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.